Staying healthy, mobile, and pain-free as we age is so important, yet it can often feel like an uphill battle. In today's episode, we're going to be talking with an expert orthopedic surgeon who specializes in shoulders and knees. He'll share invaluable insights on how to care for these critical joints, avoid injuries, manage pain, and decide when surgery may be necessary. We'll cover everything from torn rotator cuffs to knee replacements to cutting-edge treatments like stem cell therapy and 3D printing. If you want to remain active and independent well into your later years, you won't want to miss this discussion. My guest today has dedicated his career to helping people move and feel their best at any age, and he'll give us science-backed advice to do the same. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm the founder of the Silver Edge, and our mission is to help you build and maintain a lean, healthy body that you love for the rest of your life, so that you can show up in the second half of your life as the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself. We have a great show for you today. Dr. Reznik is here, and he's going to help us maintain healthy shoulders and knees for the rest of our lives. If you or a loved one is dealing with ongoing shoulder or knee issues, stick around. This episode is mandatory listening. My guest today is Dr. Alan Reznik. Dr. Reznik is a board-certified orthopedic surgeon specializing in arthroscopic surgery and sports medicine. For over 2 decades, he has been recognized as a top doc by Connecticut Magazine and one of America's top physicians. Dr. Reznik has served as team physician for the U.S. Open Tennis Championship and the New Haven Knights hockey team. He is widely published with over 60 journal articles, and he's the author of I've Fallen and I Can Get Up, A Guide to Fall Prevention, and his latest book, The Knee and Shoulder Handbook, The Keys to a Pain-Free Active Life, shares decades of orthopedic knowledge to help patients achieve the best possible recovery. I started our conversation today by asking Dr. Reznik how he got interested in medicine and specializing in shoulders and knees.
My journey is a little bit different than most because I never really was pre-med to start off with. I was in a situation where I was going to Columbia Engineering School, and I wasn't very fortunate at the time. I didn't have a lot of money, so I had to find the best possible job while I was in school. And it turned out being an engineer and having a little computer background, I landed a job at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital where they were studying sudden infant death syndrome back in the day. And engineering and computer science was really important for that. I worked for the group for 3 years, and then the doctors came to me one day and they said, we think you'd be a really good doctor. We think you should apply to medical school. And I went, what? And it was like not in the realm of possibilities. I grew up in Brooklyn. I didn't really think about that. There was no one I was the first person in my family to go to an Ivy League school. And I'm the only medical physician for miles around in my family. Even now there's some, but back then there was no one even thinking about it. So I applied, I got into Yale. Fortunately, I started off right at the top.
Yeah.
And then in medical school, I found that I was attracted back to things that were more like engineering, right? So radiology, ophthalmology, physics, and then ultimately orthopedics. My dad was an engineer and he was a master carpenter on the side. So I actually taught wood shop at one point as one of my other side jobs. So the whole idea of putting bones back together, hammers, screws, nails, plates, and then all the physiology around that and how bone is really magical structure appealed to me. And that's where I landed in orthopedics. And then in orthopedics, the soft tissue stuff got more interesting because the science about arthroscopy and cartilage and how to grow cartilage and how to fix ligaments was really in its infancy. And I was very, very fortunate early on to bump into someone who had a very engineering-like approach to the mechanics of the knee and shoulder. And really very few people were doing it back then. So then I was magnetized to those guys, if you will. And that led me to a fellowship in San Diego and another fellowship at Oxford and then back to Yale to both teach and practice private practice orthopedics. And then eventually honed my specialty in knee and shoulder arthroscopy and sports medicine.
Okay, so I love that story. That's fascinating that you started out as an engineer and then ended up working in a hospital. Somebody said, hey, this guy would be a pretty good doctor. And lo and behold, it turns out they were right. They saw something in you, right? And then that whole engineering slash carpentry from your dad's side coming together there with this in the orthopedics and
Yeah.
rebuilding things, right? I love that story. All right. So for those of us that don't know, what's an orthopedic surgeon? What do you do day to day as in that role?
Yeah. So it really goes back to the roots of what orthopedics mean. And, pedic sounds like pediatric, right? And orthos is really means straight. So the original word orthopedics really comes from the word of straightening crooked children. So if you think about polio, scoliosis, cerebral palsy, all those diseases, the kids were crooked and we had to straighten them. And it turns out that turned out to be a lot about how the bones were growing, how the spine was forming, and how the tendons were lengthening and how the muscles work. So the specialty of all those things come together and then evolve because, okay, now not only have crooked children, we have crooked adults. And now we have crooked adults, we have adults with a broken bone. Okay, now we have broken bone. Now they have arthritis later in life. Or maybe they have a torn cartilage now that might lead to arthritis later in life. How do we prevent that? So if you start at the very origins, everything kind of melded together to the specialty of everything in the musculoskeletal system. And that ranges from total joint replacements to ligament reconstruction to growing new cartilage to scoliosis surgery and taking care of broken fractures and damaged joints. So that's all melded together. So that's where orthopedics comes from. And I've done it all. I mean, I started out, I did level 1 trauma, I did general orthopedics as well as my sports fellowship. And I was actually on the designated level 1 trauma panel for Yale when they started that. And so I've kind of done it all in my training along the way. So I kind of know about all the elements of it. And I almost feel like I'm the Marcus Walby of orthopedics because I know enough about everything to get myself in a little bit of trouble.
Oh,
But so I'm not bashful about advising people on things that I don't do today as in my middle lane, but are in my peripheral lanes for my entire career. So sort of come around about to all those things at once in one place.
okay. So there's a lot in that, right? When we talk about just shoulders and knees, and we're going to break down both of these joints and talk a little bit more about them. But I'd like to back up a little bit. I think clearly people, when they think orthopedic surgeon, they're probably thinking, knee replacements or these other types of very invasive surgeries. But you had mentioned in your intro, you talked about, of course, we know there's the bone, but you talked about this soft tissue. You talked about cartilage and ligaments and tendons, and of course we have fascia and all of this. What, where does that play in your practice when you're as a surgeon? I suppose all of this is all part of one system. When we look at something as complex as a shoulder joint, for example, how much of your practice is, say, bone based? Because that's what I think of when I think of orthopedic, and how much is really more this soft tissue? And of course, we can throw muscle in there with that as well, right?
Yeah. So this is the coolest thing about orthopedics. And I think people really don't understand this at all. All the bones have really interesting shapes when you look at them. You look at a skull and you say, wow, a pelvis has got this weird contorted shape. A scapula's got a weird shape. The knee has got this funny mechanics to it with a kneecap in the front and all that. The body uniquely remodels the bone to the forces it sees. So as the bone and joints move in development, and it's really hard to fully understand this completely without getting very complicated, but the simple version of it is the body tries to minimize the stresses it sees and maximize the strengths of the functioning parts. So bone responds to stress and bone thickens where there's more stress and thins where there's less, and actually has the capacity to remodel and reshape itself. So I always like to say, like, if you imagine bone growing from an infant where femur might be that big, or, in utero, and then maybe that big when you're born, or maybe a little bit bigger. And then when you're adult, it's big, right? If it grew in the same direction all the time in all directions, eventually it would just look like a meatball, right? So the bone has to constantly resculpt and remold itself to get the shape correct. And the way that happens is all the forces of the muscles and around the joints create those forces that shape the bone. So it's the combination of the bone structure and the muscles function that ultimately give you the shape and function of all your bones and muscles in your joints and how they work. And it's that partnership that makes you walk and stand and move. And look, for example, just recently, Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles tendon, can't run, right? Why?
Yeah.
You can't power off your foot if you don't have an Achilles tendon because the muscle has nothing to attach to, right? So you can have no broken bones at all and be disabled if you cut your Achilles tendon, right? The old Achilles heel, that, proverb is
Right.
really something real, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where, when we look at the structure and function, it's very much that. And in sports, it's the combination of the muscle, bone, and joint all together. And then the cartilage pieces and bits that make it all work together. So for example, the knee, we talk about torn meniscus. What is a meniscus? It's like a C-shaped cushion, right? Two cushions that are C-shaped, and the weight goes on them and it shares the load more evenly on the surface. And in doing that, it decreases the wear of the joint. So it's important to have the longevity of your knee to have good meniscal cartilages in your knee, as well as the surface cartilage, and they work in partnership. So if you tear your meniscus badly, you're more likely to get arthritis later if we don't do something about it.
Hmm. Okay, so we're definitely going to come back to arthritis, I'm sure, in our conversation here today. But I wanted to ask you when we talk about, because you had mentioned that when we put these stresses on the bones, that they're reshaping, reforming, growing, potentially shrinking or thinning. Those of us listening, we're most of us 50s, 60s, maybe 70s. What is our potential as we age to continue strengthening or building both the soft tissues you're talking about, these connective tissues, as well as the actual bone?
Yeah, I like to think the active lifestyle really helps everybody, right? If you have some type of active lifestyle, and for some people, it's as little as 20 minutes a day of walking, vertical weight bearing and moving your body. And other people, like today, right before this interview, I had a break between patients and the interview. I went out for a half-hour bike ride. They're like a 5-6 mile loop, and then came back and got ready because it helps for clarity of mind. It helps for physical fitness. It helps, every part of your body to keep things moving and going and keep some decent strength and function. That expression, you don't lose it, you use it, you lose it, right?
Right.
That's really true for muscles. And it's fascinating. Like we're all the age that the space program was something that was really important to us growing up, right? Everyone remembers going to the moon. When you go to zero gravity, you lose a gram of calcium a day of your bone gets lost. You urinate it out, you lose it. So when you see the people in the space station, they're busy running with straps on their arms and weights, and they're doing all these things to try to simulate gravity. Why? Because they don't want to lose the calcium they have. And why is that happening? Your body's so efficient. It says, oh, I don't need my bones to be so heavy because I'm not seeing gravity. Conversely, if you add gravity as part of your exercises, right, with some light weights even, and you keep moving, you're going to maintain your bone better, right? So if you're lying on the couch all day, you don't do much, you eat bonbons, your bones are going to waste away. But if you're active and you do a little weight bearing exercises every day, you're going to maintain your bone health better. So that's one of the things you can do right off the bat.
So it sounds like then, if I could paraphrase, basically that the bone density loss we might see as we're aging probably has less to do with the fact that we're aging and more to do with maybe a sedentary lifestyle, if we're not doing these weight bearing exercises to really send, I guess, a stimulus to that bone. Is it fair to say that I can increase say the bone density? I'm not sure I'm using the right vocabulary here, with things like resistance training, or you'd mentioned, weight bearing walking, things like that.
That's the $5 zillion question, right? The truth is, and this is always hard to figure this out. Calcium is essential for all kinds of function in your body, right? You need calcium for your nerves to work, your brain to work, your heart to work. Calcium channels are extremely important in how a lot of different mechanisms in your body work. And so the body's main goal is to keep the calcium level in your bloodstream even all the time. If it goes out of whack, it's a problem. Your bone is a massive storage house for calcium. So if you're slightly deficient in calcium every day, and most of us are, because it's hard to have 4 milk equivalents of calcium every day, right? We borrow from our bone regularly just to maintain our blood levels of calcium. So this is a multifold problem, right?
Gotcha.
To metabolize the calcium, probably you need vitamin D. Some people are D deficient. Some people are D resistant. They can eat D all day and they need more than anyone else, right? Some people don't get any sun exposure for a lot of reasons that they don't have enough D. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you don't have calcium in your diet, you can't do anything with the D. It doesn't matter, right? And the third thing is, if you're not weight bearing, at least some of the time, or doing some resistive exercises, even a light amount, there's no impetus to keep your bone, right? So you need motivation, you need the supplies, and you need the hormone, the vitamin D, which is really like a hormone almost, to process and absorb. Vitamin D is important in absorbing calcium, and vitamin D is important in metabolizing calcium. So without those 3 components, you get into trouble, and any one of them will mess you up, right? So rickets, which was a disease that before they put vitamin D in milk, the kids had bow leg. Go back to straight children, right? The kids would get bow leg. Why? without vitamin D, their bones were so soft while they're growing, the bones would melt and collapse a little. The knees would bow because of the weight bearing. The bones couldn't hold the force, right? So, again, this like magical little puzzle of all the parts that fit together are key, and one alone won't do it.
Gotcha. It just reminds me, I'm grinning as you say that, just because that's why I love these kinds of conversations, right? That's a nuanced explanation where if I were to make an Instagram post about bone health, hey, drink calcium for your bone health or do weight resistance training for bone health, both good things, right? Or maybe go get some
Yeah,
sunlight for bone health. But really to have this more nuanced conversation about some of these complexities and these multifactorial things that all have to be in perfect alignment in order to optimize, especially as we're aging, right? Maybe able to get
absolutely,
away with a little, maybe we get away with more when we're younger, I suppose, than as we move into these later years. All right.
absolutely.
Well, Dr. Resnick, I wanted to back up a little bit and kind of set the stage here. What is the prevalence? And in my case, let's just say in this age demographic, our 50s, 60s, maybe even 70s. So we're not looking at the 80s and 90s are have a different set of issues. We're not looking at some of the what I'll call the younger people. But what's the prevalence of knee and shoulder problems and pain? And I guess there's two buckets, right? There's something acute happens. I tore a rotator cuff, or I was in an accident and I messed up my joint. And then there's more what I really want to dig into, more that kind of what I'll call a chronic issue. What what do you see? What is the most prevalent out there for
Yeah,
knees and
yeah.
shoulders
So,
for us?
I just want to wipe away a little bit of the age differential, because I hate to say people are 80-year-old, because I got some 80-year-olds who really yell at me because they're out there playing tennis and
I
pickleball and
love
they're
it.
having a great
I
time.
absolutely love it.
And I
Yeah.
have some young people who really could learn something from the 80-year-olds that really could be a little
100%
more
with you
active because
there.
they're on their
Yes.
video
Yep.
games too much. So
Yeah.
some age gets blurred now a little bit in that respect, because I have some older people who are out there hurting themselves. Someone who's like the oldest woman Iron Man is
Mhm.
one of my patients, happens to be doing that, and she's 60s, 70s and doing Ironman. So I mean, I can't do it. So
Yeah.
so the age thing, I like to blur that a little bit, because I think the general principles are similar for everyone, but more focused when you're trying to avoid losing things, right? Like we talked about already, staying a little active. But what I like to talk about is, and we'll talk about separate buckets. But first of all, like, okay, you do something, you have a little muscle soreness and aches. Next day you shake it off, it's fine. Most of the time when we're training, we get that, and that's pretty common. If you can't shake it off, then I'm more worried, right? Than about that. On the flip side, if you have a joint that becomes painful, swells, and the swelling doesn't go away either, or or just swells at all, I mean, that's more serious, right? Because joints typically just don't swell for no reason. They swell because they're mad. Now, they could be swelling because you got Lyme disease. You don't even know it. You got a tick bite 2 weeks ago and your knee's now swollen. You don't even notice the tick bite. It could be a rheumatoid arthritis. You could have gout. You could have all those other things, right? Or it could be you tore a cartilage or a ligament, or you damaged the surface. If it's the latter, damage to the inside of the joint, then the upshot is that those things, if you continue to pound on them, if you will, they're going to get worse, right?
Mm.
You're going to do more damage, right? Whereas, if you have gout, you got to figure that out, right? Because that's going to cause damage to your knee. If you have Lyme disease, you need an antibiotic. So I think the rule of thumb for me is, like, if I have all of a sudden swelling of a joint and a sharp pain after some activity, and the swelling persists for more than a little bit of time, or the swelling happens immediately afterwards, I have something happen and I swell within the first hour, that's pretty serious. Usually I swell between 4 and 6 hours. Sometimes that's a ligament tear, and some people swell the next day. It's sometimes a cartilage injury. So like fractures tend to swell faster, ligaments in between, and cartilage later. But those are mechanical reasons for swelling. But those are all red flags to me. You got to see someone get it checked out, right?
Yeah.
But the sore muscles, everyone gets that.
Yeah. So what in your practice people are coming to you, what are they primarily coming to you for? Are they already pretty advanced by the time they get to somebody? And I say you, I mean you and just orthopedic surgeons in general, orthopedic practitioners. Are they there because they've fallen? Are they there because they've been acutely injured in doing a sport? Or are they there more for chronic, there's just this nagging shoulder here, I just can't get it right. Lately it's been worse and worse. Why are people showing up in your waiting rooms?
Yeah. Well, I think the for shoulders, the number one reason people show up for shoulder problems, they can't sleep anymore. You
Mm,
know, The
Sleep
number
on their
two
side
reason
and it's
people,
too painful.
right?
Yeah. Okay.
It's so painful they can't sleep. They're miserable. They just can't sleep anymore. And in fact, for rotator cuff tears, it's probably the number one reason why people want me to fix it is more than anything else. Weakness they could deal with, occasional pains they deal with, but they haven't slept in 3 months because every night it wakes them up and they can't go back to sleep. That's when people are more concerned and they really are in trouble because it gets, physically disabling in a way. You're not sleeping.
Hmm.
So that's for shoulders. That's the number one reason people come in. For knees, it's often instability. Like, oh, my knee has become unreliable, right? I'm doing the sport and I cut to the right and I go out and I go down and I swell and whatever, or it's given away or it's got physically stuck and won't go back or my kneecap has slipped out of place. I mean, so a physically unreliable knee, that often is what people come in for there. Those are the two main things. The chronic things, I mean, they know they have a problem. They've heard it 10, 20 years ago. And it's just getting worse and worse, right? And so they say, okay, now I just can't take it anymore. I know I've had my bum knee. I heard it in high school. It's always given me a little trouble. I stopped doing 3 different things. Now I just swim and bike, but now I
Yeah.
can't even bike anymore because my knee has gotten bad. So those are the two main, kind of split them into chronic and acute, like you said. Those are the ways that it falls around.
Yeah. And it seems to me, looking at chronic pain, there's got to be an intersection or there's got to be this. At what point do I go to a physical therapist for rehab, right, for chronic pain versus come to an orthopedic specialist? Is that something that somewhere along the line, is it going to be that, hey, that chronic pain, I've just had it and it's getting worse, PT's ineffective, and are you the next level? Or what's the deciding factor when I go see somebody like you versus just my regular physical therapist type rehab?
Yeah, for most people, they will see their primary care doctor for a lot of things, and they will see, and in many states, you can see a physical therapist first for some things. Some people go to a chiropractor. But there's a lot of different entries into the healthcare system. Again, everyone has different levels of expertise, and then of course there's Dr. Google, right? So
Yeah.
people go online and look things up.
Yeah.
Everything has its pluses and minuses, right? If you have really nothing serious wrong, you probably go to any of those sources and probably not hurt yourself. If you're a smart person and you don't go some crazy wild cure or whatever. But I think when people start to scratch their head and they start to get 2 or 3 different ideas from their friends, and then they get 2 or 3 different ideas from people they see, and the things are not going away, they really need to see someone who specializes in what's wrong with them. And someone who has a broad experience who's able to kind of give them, hey, really, this thing that's really bothering your knee is really coming from your hip or your back. The song, the knee bone is connected to the hip bone.
Yeah.
I have a number of patients in my practice who've actually had terrible hip problems, including one that had a fractured hip, didn't even know it. And knee pain can be referred. So you could have a terrible knee pain and it's really your hip. And so I see a number of people with terrible hip arthritis, think it's a knee. They get injected, they get seen, they get x-ray, they get tested, they even get an MRI. Someone even might say, oh, there's a little meniscal tear there. I'm going to operate and fix it. And then lo and behold, 6 months later, it's still the same pain. And then someone takes an x-ray of their hip and turns out their hip is arthritic and they needed a total hip years ago and they just been ignoring it. And every once in a while you get schnurkered because the referral is so strong. People are absolutely convinced it's their knee. They don't believe anything else you tell them. And I've even had a couple of patients where I have to physically show them the x-ray before they believe me that it really is their hip. So, it's like being a detective sometimes. Someone comes in and sometimes they say something to you and they don't even understand what parts of what they're saying is even important for the figuring out what's wrong. So again, I like to say to people, it's a history. You're going to tell someone a story, right? And the story has to kind of make some sense. What's really happened over the last month, 6 weeks, a year, whatever this time frame is. It's then a physical exam. I can't underestimate the importance of a good exam where you check and feel and touch and see. I have a lot of people come in the office, they get their x-ray and then they put all their clothes back on, right? And I come in the room and I say, don't you want me to examine you? It's like, oh, I didn't know you were going to do that. Right?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, but your knee is swollen. I can't see that through your dungarees. And you're telling me it's swollen, but I don't know how swollen it is. And maybe both your knees are swollen. I don't know yet. I don't know if your hip moves well or your foot got a problem, or maybe you have psoriasis and I don't even know that. And you have psoriatic arthritis, So when I go and look at someone, I have a list of thousands of things that float around in my head about what could be wrong. And then ultimately, piecing that puzzle together with the history And the exam tells me a lot about what's next. And then a plain x-ray. So many people come to the office, aren't you going to do an MRI? It's like, well, I know what's wrong with you. You have gout. You don't need an MRI. Or I know what's wrong with you. Your leg is broken. I can see it on the x-ray. It is broken. It's not going to get better with an MRI. So there are so many things that I know without an MRI. And remember this, I trained at a time where there were no MRIs, right? In fact, CAT scan was like just beginning when I was in medical school. And since I was an engineer, actually, Pfizer hired me to go look at their CAT scanning units all over the country and give an opinion, because I was an engineer and I needed a summer job because I needed some money. And I got hired by Pfizer because they had bought a CAT scan company. Pfizer thought at one point they'd be like GE and they'd be like this big imaging company on the side. And that didn't work out for them. But in the middle, I got a really good job and they paid me a good amount of money to write a 150-page report about how to fix their units. But at that time, CAT scan was very rudimentary, and then MRI after that. Both CAT scan and MRI have their pros and cons. They're different types of studies. They have different things that they're better at. And they both have false positives and false negatives. So people say, oh, I want an MRI. Well, you just injured your knee yesterday. You're all swollen. It's bruised up. The MRI is going to show swelling and bruising everywhere. It's not going to help me as much as the fact that when I examine you, all your ligaments are intact. You have no meniscal signs and you have a tiny bit of swelling. I think you just basically bruised your knee up. Your x-rays are negative. The MRI will say, yes, you have a very bad bruise. Well, that would be a very expensive bad bruise.
Yeah.
Right. And you can imagine if everyone in the universe got an MRI, the whole system would be bankrupt, especially since MRI doesn't always pick up some things and MRI overreads other things. So we have to be a little careful.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I like the idea of you talking about kind of playing detective, right? Coming in, listen to the patient rather, and figuring out where, what's going on, what's the history here, what is happening right now, looking for potentially deferred pain, etc. All right. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about shoulders first and then knees. We'll just work our way north to south on a body. I want to start with shoulders just because I find the shoulder joint just to be fascinating. Is there any other joint in our body that's this mobile, that can move in this many directions? It's just a fascinating joint. Talk to us a little bit about the shoulder and what we might see in terms of injuries, in terms of pain. I know people have talked about rotator cuff tears, frozen shoulders. We might have some tendonitis. People probably have heard of like AC joints. Talk to us a little bit about the shoulder, its mechanics, why it's fascinating, if you find it so. And then
you're hitting the top 10 there.
Is that right?
You got it. You hit it all on the nail on the head there. There's so many parts of that that's so fantastic. And you kind of mentioned a lot of the big ones, like you said, what's their top 5 or top 10 things?
That got to be them. Yeah. Okay.
You're doing a pretty good job there. But so the first part, which you said was really nice. I mean, the shoulder puts your hand in space, right? It puts your hand in space.
I didn't think about that, but that's exactly what it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's the platform your hand and arm rest on. And without the shoulder mobility, you can't get your hand all the places it goes, right? So to get your hand all over your body, your shoulder has to be the most mobile joint of all the joints. And it achieves that in a very interesting way. The platform that the socket is on is mobile, right? So the scapula, the shoulder blade, actually moves. And in fact, when you raise your arm over your head, a full 30% of that elevation is rotation of the shoulder blade, and the rest is movement of the ball and socket. So you would lose 30 or 40% of your range of motion right away if your shoulder blade wasn't moving, just in overhead motion, and you lose even more in rotation and so on. The shoulder itself is a very, very flat joint. So in order to be stable, the shoulder blade has to move to position itself under the maximum force. Remember, we talked about how the body is structured in a way that all the forces equalize. So if you imagine the ball, and I'll just do this with my hands for a second, the ball and socket, and the ball is relatively flat. If the ball pulls down this way, there's no resistance. But if I move my shoulder blade and then I pull, there's more resistance, right? So by positioning your shoulder blade, the shoulder becomes inherently more stable. Okay. Now, interestingly, it's an interesting tell. We talked about being a detective and trying to figure out what's wrong with people. And someone complains to me about their shoulder and I stand behind them sometimes. And I don't always have to do this to see it, but sometimes it's nice to do it. Take your shirt off, stand behind you, and ask you to raise both your hands over your head and then bring them back down. Many times you'll see the shoulder blades move differently. there's dyskinesis. They're out of sync with each other, for a better way of saying it. And you see that out of syncness, you say, oh, somehow my shoulder blade's trying to protect something that's not right. And sometimes that means a torn cartilage in your shoulder. Sometimes that means a rotator cuff tear. So there's little tells when you do those things on an exam. And it's partially because the shoulder blade makes up a lot of the motion that you can see some things like that. Other people, they're just very round shoulder. They're on the computer all day. And when you do that, or on the phone, excuse me, when you get your shoulders really curled in and round, it closes the top of the shoulders down. When you close the top of the shoulder down, you lose range of motion going up. So some people have a lot of shoulder tendonitis, rotator cuff irritation, bursitis, primarily because their posture is poor and their shoulder blades are rounded when they're straight. And you could do this yourself. If you imagine rolling your shoulders forward, the listeners could do this at home. It's a great little thing. Roll your shoulders forward as far as you can and try to raise your hand over your head as high as you can. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And then, right. And then bring your sternum, the top of your chest, up towards the sun as much as you can. Right.
Yeah.
I call it sternum to the sun. And when you get up to the sun, now try to raise your hand up as high as you can. You'll see it go higher much easier.
100%.
So that small difference is sometimes the difference between people who have a painful shoulder and don't have a painful shoulder, is that their posture sets them up for trouble.
And now, how prevalent is that? Because it seems to me that most of us, of course, we're on our mobile devices. Most of us spend the vast majority of our life in that hunched over position. We're driving, we're on our laptops, we're on our phones. Is that very common, I guess, at this point?
Yeah, it is very common. And I kind of joke about it with some like young kids who are very athletic and they do a lot of weight training. And you know, if you say, you know, you have Mack trucks or Hummers in the front because your pecs are so strong and your biceps are so strong, right? And in the back you have Pinto or Vega or Yugo, right? And the Yugo and Vegas are trying to balance your shoulder against the Hummer and the Mack truck, and they just lose all the time. And to get kids to work on better posture and rhomboids and upper trap and get that balance and get the abdomen in when they're functioning is tricky. And the second piece of this, and I like to talk about this a lot because it's very important in every age group, but also in young throwing athletes, is balance, right? So if you can imagine for a minute, if you're standing on very slippery ice with flat shoes that have no tread and you try to throw a ball, what happens?
Yeah, not so good.
You fall flat on your face usually, right? Because you need to push off of something to generate arm power. So if your hip is weak and you have poor hip balance, and you do this with the kids on a little league team, and it's so interesting, you know, the pitcher, you say, stand on one leg and just do a one-legged squat. And they all almost fall over because they have no hip balance at all. But they're in the weight room lifting and their quads are great and their muscles are great. And they have trouble throwing at any velocity because they can't control their hip. And it's the weakest link, right? So your foot is on the ground, your knee is balanced, you use your Achilles tendon, you use your quads tendon, you use your hip flexors and your torso, and then you get power in your arm. And that's last. So, you know, if you look at the best baseball pitchers have very strong legs and incredible turning ability, and they turn their entire body around their hip with incredible control, and they have great accuracy. But if they don't have that hip control, they don't have anything. And so I see a lot of people with shoulder problems, they're, again, barking up the wrong tree. Shoulder problem, injected, operated on, stabilization procedures, all kinds of stuff, rehab. And at the end of the day, they have no hip balance and they can't throw because they're overthrowing. And it happens in transition, right? If you're a young, good thrower and you're very, very young, you can get away with all arm. But as you get older and you go to the full 90 feet, you can't get away with all arm. You have to use your whole body. And as you get older, as you remain athletic, if you have poor hip balance, you lose speed on your golf swing, you lose speed on your tennis serve, you get tennis elbow more frequently if you have poor hip balance. You know, you might fall with I want to say pickleball, but pickleball might fall down in pickleball because that's so popular now.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lot of pickleball injuries now because it's so popular. But again, because some people just don't have good hip balance and they get into trouble.
Well, I know we're talking about shoulders, but I suppose this is going to be a knee, hip, and shoulder and foot. I mean, it's going to be a whole kinetic chain here, right? Question. But would you talk about your throwing athletes? And I'm thinking probably in my age group, that's more of my tennis players, my golfers, pickleballers, these people that are very rotational, but just very one-sided, right? how does that imbalance of that, because we've created this movement pattern that we're doing repetitively that's very one-sided. Does that have an effect? It's got an effect on the body, absolutely, but does that have an effect for shoulder health and for knee health?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, anything, we talked about the whole body, right? You're right. You have to have your whole body working well. People have an inner ear problem. They can't play some sports because they don't have the balance from their inner ear, right? Or if they have a visual problem, they have a bad cataract in one eye, and they lose depth of field, they can't play as certain sports, or they have a harder time. So, I mean, all these things are connected. Your body is an amazing machine, right? And taking good care of it is what gets you through your 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right?
Yep.
So, if you have a visual problem and you have a cataract that needs to be taken care of, it's going to be easier to play if you get it taken care of, right?
Sure.
You'll see the lines on the ground better. You won't trip over the ball so easily and stuff like that. So yes, so all those things are important. But again, good strength. People don't recognize sometimes they strengthen the big muscles like the quads, but they don't strengthen the small muscles like the hip rotators, or they strengthen the biceps and the deltoid and the triceps, but they never work on the rotator cuff. So all those things are related. And so many times when I piece together the puzzle, it's a conversation about what's really wrong and then what do we do later to prevent it from coming back.
Yeah, okay, so that's a great segue here because that's as you're talking about this, that's where my mind is going. What's our prescription then for those of us that are blessed with stay on shoulders, blessed with healthy shoulders right now? How do I not end up in your waiting room? What's my blueprint for
Yeah, I
taking care
actually
of my shoulders all the way into my, let's just say my 90s. I want to be able to throw something and put something up over top of my head. Just maintain good shoulder strength and stability and mobility all my life.
Yeah, that's the tricky one. Knees and hips are a little easier because balance
Mhm.
exercise, everyone kind of knows what they are. Quad strengthening, walking, biking, swimming, those are all good. Shoulders a little trickier because part of it is posture, part of it is good balance. So those two things are probably key. Poor posture will get you trouble with your shoulder. Poor balance will get you trouble with your shoulder. Tend to overthrow or use your arms too much. The second part of it is rotational strength of the shoulder itself. So rotator cuff over deltoid and biceps, triceps, because everyone does biceps and triceps, right? So, but few people do small rotational exercises with a TheraBand or a rubber band in the gym, those kinds of things, cable column. And the last thing I love to describe, and remember I told you shoulder sternum to the sun, right? That little
Mm.
idea. I've all my career, I've kind of looked for ideas where there's something simple I can say to someone that will help them understand a much more complicated concept, right? So sternum to the sun automatically gets your shoulders back, your rhomboids working, and your abdomen in, and that opens up your shoulder. That's fantastic. It's an easy thing to say and do. For years, I struggled. I didn't know what to say, but when I came up with that one day, it was like, oh, this is perfect. I get it, right? The next one is I like to think of this, and some people get a little taken back when I say it. So we're not monkeys, right? And monkeys can hang by their shoulder all day. Their shoulders are inherently a little bit different than ours, right? We are really primarily designed to do stuff with our hands in front of our face. If you think about that for a second, right? Because they're super fine mobility. Look at our fingers, watch what we're doing, make jewelry, fix a watch, make an iPhone.
Yeah.
Or, touch the little buttons. We're very good at that. And we're really designed to do that. Ultra fine motor control, visualization, very fine vision, all that stuff. So if you think about that for a second, if we're optimized to do stuff in front of our face, if I'm doing an exercise where I don't see my hands, most likely that's going to be problematic. So I'll lat pull down behind my head where my hands go behind my head. And I don't see my hands. That as you get older, that gets very hard for your shoulders, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I always tell my patients who start to have shoulder trouble as they get older that to try to remember that the exercises where you see your hands are going to be better than the exercises when you don't see your hands, right? Which
Now
is a
that being
simple
said,
idea.
that being said, what about things like pull-ups or lat pull down where I'm coming down in front
Right.
of my
So I
body?
like the lat pull down to be the bottom half, right? You can spot it and then do the bottom half as the reps, as opposed to all the way up and all the way down,
Oh,
right?
now this is fascinating to me. Okay,
Right.
so because well, let's discuss this.
You're
I
right.
would say so for example, myself, in fact, this morning I did weighted pull-ups. And I'm going to be 60 in the spring. At what point do I surrender that full range of motion that I have the strength, mobility, capability of doing? Am I doing harm for my 80-year-old self by doing those exercises now? Would I be better off, in other words, from a longevity standpoint, to do what you're saying? Let's just get on a lat pull down and do what you were describing, a partial range of motion, as opposed to maintaining that function of that full range of motion. And we're talking specifically about overhead here, right? Because
Mhm.
clearly my hands aren't in my range of vision when I'm all the way overhead.
Right.
Would that be your recommendation from just a longevity
So this is the
standpoint?
interesting thing. If you can do those things with absolutely no pain, right? And
Right.
your
Okay.
shoulders don't hurt you, and
Right.
you're fine, and you're smooth, and you're very good at it, and it's in relative terms for you not super crazy challenging, right? Because some people
Right.
do these exercises and they're like so beyond challenging, right?
Right.
That they're hurting every time they do it. More power to you. Great. Okay,
Okay.
fine.
Gotcha.
Because you're doing
But
good form, smooth exercise. You're not hurting yourself while you're doing it. You don't do more reps than you really can. You're doing it for strength and
correct.
maintenance, but you're not going crazy,
Correct.
right?
Right.
Probably okay. But if you're doing it and every time it hurts, then I'd say, okay, let's look at a shorter arc. Let's maybe not add the weight to my whatever weight you add. Let's do it without a weight. Let's try to figure out, you do the machine where you stand on the platform. So it's 3/4 your weight, not your full body weight.
Right.
So, and the arc, maybe you shorten the arc up a bit. You don't do full extension, full bottom. It's actually a little harder, right? If you do a pull up and you only do a half arc, it's actually harder to do that because you can't let it rest at the top or the bottom, right? You're not hanging at the
Yeah.
end, right?
So yeah, so a full, so you're actually in a dead hang at the top. Yes, that is more. Yes, that
Right. Right.
you're on your skeleton system there as opposed to
Right.
time under tension with the muscles. So I see what you're saying there.
Right.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's
So you could do a
interesting. Yeah.
shorter duration of a half rep. You're going to get more out of it than hanging at the bottom after every one and then restarting. Right.
Sure.
And that's sometimes where people get hurt. They're hanging at the bottom and they try to get themselves back up again. Right. They
Okay.
sometimes
Yeah.
hurt
So
themselves.
we're tracking 100% then. If, for example, we'll just use a pull up for an example. If you have to do crazy contortions and kips, or if you don't have complete, smooth, muscular mobility control of that forward, if you don't own that movement, it's probably not, not a good idea. You probably should back off and do something more like what you're saying.
Or
Maybe
work your way up to it with the
work
assisted
your way up
movements.
to that, work your way up to
Right.
that.
So
Okay.
you can work your way up because you first start out, most people, very hard to do a pull up if you've never done
Sure.
them. Right.
Yes. And
So
in
if
fact,
you can
that's
do it, a lot of the
if you're
gyms
over
have that
50 and you could do
platform.
one of those, you're in the top 1% of 50-year-olds, right? Perhaps the top 1/2%. I don't know. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're right. You're probably right. That's not the easiest exercise to start with. I would
Sure.
do a bunch of other stuff first.
But I want to, in terms of strengthening shoulder, is it fair to say that, not going crazy, but just using good, well thought out, professionally designed exercise programming, specifically for the shoulders, and applying the principles of progressive overload to either build or maintain muscle mass in the shoulders? Is that, I mean, we could say, hey, I could do that for a number of reasons. I could do it aesthetically, right? I just want big shoulders, or I could do that for, well, what I really want is healthy mobile shoulders when I'm 80 and 90. Is there something I should be considering in my exercise programming now, outside of, well, don't do crazy shit, right? Don't, with
Yeah.
your hands over your head and struggling or flailing. Are there things that I need to think about for programming for longevity, specifically for
Well,
long-term shoulder health?
I like variety, I mean, and that's
Okay.
just a general statement, right? So I
Yep.
like people to try to mix it up as much as they can, try to alternate the types of exercises they do. In my gym, and again, everyone has different stuff, right? So you have a lot of people do 90% of their aerobics through their legs, right? They get on an elliptical, they get on a Stairmaster, they beat the crap out of their knee. Yeah, but they beat their knees up, right?
Sure.
So I like sometimes to do rows, just do a little rows, not go crazy, but do rows because you're doing your upper body for aerobics
Mhm.
more than your legs in a row. Or there's a standing, my gym, we have this airdyne thing with the wheel where you can do an upper bike, or you can even do the one with the two cables where you pretend you're cross-country skiing, but you're not
Yeah.
moving your legs.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of variety of things you can do. And then I also like circuit training for some people, right? So some people like, and particularly I have this question all the time. I have someone who's a chronic knee problem and wants to keep an aerobic workout. And if you have a chronic knee problem and you actually do a heavy aerobic workout that involves, let's say, elliptical at an angle or a treadmill at an incline, you're going to kill your knees. So
Yeah.
you got to find stuff to do to get your heart rate up, maintain your heart rate up. It isn't involved only just your knees.
Sure.
So for people as they get older, I like people to kind of drift towards a little more circuit training, just as a kind of rule if things start to give you trouble. Like I used to like to run. I like to bike now more because the impact of running is a little tougher on me, for a lot of reasons. So biking seems to work better. Kayak, a paddleboard, and I play golf and I walk and carry. So, I mean, I do those things, but I'm not running the way I used to, 8 miles a day and things like that, because it's just too hard at this point for me to do that.
Yeah.
So you
It
mix
sounds
those
like
up.
it's honoring the body, what works for you. We're all a little bit different, right? And just finding that sweet spot that is keeping you active, getting you that bit of cardio, that bit of strength training, but is doing, I always say you want to, when it comes to, let's say, strength training specifically, and then we could say the same for cardio, I suppose, you want to do the least amount of work to get the most amount of results. And I think that that's a good rule of thumb for a lot of people. Now, before we completely leave the shoulders here, you had mentioned a lot of people are, they're doing a lot of exercises for their shoulders. And the classic when we think of shoulders would be like, say, an overhead barbell press. And many people over 60, just for you had already mentioned, they don't have that range of motion, right? So there are other pushing motions that we can work on. But you had mentioned specifically rotator cuff. A lot of people don't develop that. Is that the classic internal and external kind of banded
Yeah.
rotational
Yeah.
work? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Cable column rotations. Sometimes
Sure.
put it with a pillow. Like sometimes you put a pillow between your chest and, or, one of those small little foam
Same
things
here.
just to get your elbow out a little bit. And
Okay.
so,
Yeah.
because what I don't want people to do is really use their deltoid for that so much. And if you have
Mhm.
to kind of hold your arm away from your body, you kind of use your deltoid a little bit. So if you put the small little thin pillow there and you rotate against your ribs, you're actually purifying a little more pure rotation, right? That trainers get into that much more than I do.
Sure.
I leave that
Yeah.
to the therapists and trainers to discuss it more because I'm busy focused on, okay, this is broken. What are we going to do? Fix it? How
Yeah.
do I
Yeah.
rehab you?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
The other thing that people underestimate is eccentric exercise, right?
Mm.
So that muscles uniquely strengthen better in the opposite direction that we think.
Right.
So if you let your biceps extend slowly when you're doing a biceps curl, that's actually better for your biceps, and same thing for your quads, and same thing for your cuffs. So, right. So resisted band exercise where you let it go back slowly, not just let it go, and you resist both ways, is better for you than just pulling one way and then letting it go. Right. So
It
to
is that
strengthen on both
that's
ends.
that would be true both for hypertrophy, for muscle building and health, as well as the joint then, right? That you're talking about that slower negative you mentioned in a curl, just that
Yeah, yeah, and it
slower.
helps stabilize the joint better. Sure, all that stuff is great. That's all good stuff.
And when we think of weight training, we're typically concerned with building muscle. And of course, those of us over 50, that's something we should be concerned with. But am I also building, is it fair to say that I'm building that tendon, that cartilage, that bone, that fascia? Is that, I mean, it's got to be healthy for that, but am I actually strengthening those soft tissues, those connective tissues, or not so much?
Oh, absolutely. So the thing that people don't understand is muscle, cartilage, they're all alive, right?
Hmm.
And they have cells that maintain them. So in that they have cells that maintain them, good nutrition is important, obviously calcium, vitamin D, and all that stuff, and regular exercise in moderation, not extremes, does a lot for health of those structures, right? Because cartilage gets its nourishment from the fluid that bathes it. It's not, doesn't have direct blood supply, right? So in the meniscal cartilage and the cartilage on the surface of the joints and the knee and all the other, it's small compressions of that cartilage and then releasing that pump the fluid through the space like a microscopic sponge.
Hmm.
And that fluid flow is what brings nutrients to the cartilage cells. So loading and unloading in moderation actually is great for cartilage health. There's something called Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law is your body and bone respond more to bone than anything else to the pressures it sees. And bone is a very interesting substance. It's so magical. It's called piezoelectric. What does that mean? It means that as I compress it, little tiny currents of electricity are created. The electric currents give signals to build the bone back up.
Mm.
So as you do weight bearing, like walk 20 minutes a day, you're creating that little electrical signals. The body says, oh, I need to make more bone here. Same thing true for the cartilage and the muscles and tendons. So as you use your muscles and tendons, they do enlarge, but they all happen at different rates. So what happens to some people, like growing children, the bone will grow much faster than the muscles and tendons. So a 12-year-old going to age 15 might become very gawky and very uncomfortable with sports and have a lot of trouble and even have growing pains because they're growing faster than their muscles and tendons can catch up, and they have a lot of difficulties. And the same thing when you get stiff and you're older. Let's say I tear my Achilles and I heal it with scar tissue. It's going to take me a long time to get flexibility back in that
Yeah.
tissue because my scar tissue as you get older isn't going to remodel and heal as fast as I would if I was 18. So the active healing process varies through your whole life. And we have to give a little grace. Sometimes I do an arthroscopic rotator cuff repair on someone and they don't have a lot of pain 2 or 3 weeks later, but the bone has to heal to the tendon has to mature, and then the collagen has to be replaced by new collagen. And it really takes a year, you know? So, things start to feel better in 6 weeks and people say, oh, I went home and I lifted this giant pot and I heard a pop. What happened? Well, yeah, it didn't heal yet. And you tore all the stitches,
Mm.
you weren't really ready. So the problem for me nowadays, and it's so interesting because when we used to do these operations years ago, when I started my practice before arthroscopic surgery was really a thing, we're just beginning the beginnings. I did my first arthroscopy in 1987, a long time ago.
Yeah.
But things have changed a lot in all those years and the techniques are so much better. But what we used to do then is we look inside, see the problem, and then cut everything open, move the muscle away, take a chisel out, clean the bone, drill holes, put
Yeah.
screws and things
Wow.
in and
Yeah.
sew it back together and then put everything back on the outside and it'd be a big incision. Well, that hurt for 3 months by itself. No one tried to move it until the tendon was healed because you couldn't move anything. Everything hurt like, what. So now I look at it with the fiber optic telescope and I do everything on the inside and I move the bone around, sew everything better, roughen the edge up, put the tendon back. I do the same exact operation I used to do when I took the deltoid off and put the deltoid back, but I don't take the deltoid off and put it back.
Yeah.
And 6 weeks later, people say, oh, I feel great, Dr. Reznik, but why can't I lift this TV? It's like, yeah, because before you wouldn't do anything for 3 months and let it heal. Now you feel so good, you try to do something. So I always sometimes tell my patients, listen, it's like baking a souffle. You open the oven a little too soon, it's all for nothing because the whole thing collapses
Yeah.
on you, right?
Yeah. Right.
So I said, we're baking a special souffle right here. It's called your shoulder. And it's going to be cookbook a little bit. There's going to be certain times when you're ready for certain things. And even though you feel great, you're not ready. The other thing I tell my patients is sometimes the enemy of good is better. And that's true for exercise sometimes too, right?
Oh, yeah.
I did 12
100%.
sets of
I'm
that,
tracking with you on that. Yep.
right? I did 12 sets of those yesterday. I'm going to do 15 this week. And then all of a sudden something goes boing. And then you say, what was that? And you don't know what you did, ruptured a muscle or something. So it's true for healing too. If everything is going perfectly and I say, oh, I'm just going to try to make it that much better because I'm smarter than my doctor. I know he said I'm not allowed to do this, but I feel great. Trust me, you're not smarter than Mother Nature. You might be smarter than your doctor. You might be smarter than Dr. Google. You might be smarter than yourself, but Mother Nature doesn't really care.
Right.
It's not nice to fool Mother Nature if you remember those commercials, right? Mother Nature gets
100%.
mad. Mother
Yeah.
Nature is mad. So it does take its sweet time. And even like ACL reconstruction, which I do a fair amount of, you put the new ligament in, the second you take the donor site, no matter which one you use, whether it's frozen tendon or your own tendon, your hamstrings, patella tendon, quads tendon, all the different choices there are today. The second you take that tendon out, it's dead. You put it back in, right? Then the body has to revascularize that. And I tell people, this is just like the people working on the highway, right? If you ever watch people paving the highway, right? How long does it take and how many lunch breaks do they get? And, they don't work on the weekend and they take some highway up, they put some new highway down. And how long is it before they put the new lines on the highway? It's a very long time. And the highway doesn't ride very well until the lines are on it, right? So if you imagine the ligament being reconstituted with new blood vessels, new collagen, reattaching to bone, and you say, these are all union workers in there. They're going to, not the disunion workers. They're just doing it very nicely and methodically and slowly. And they've got their vacation and everything else they're allowed to have. And they just, your body takes time. And sometimes people really get gung-ho. They want to rush their body and their body doesn't really get rushed.
All right. So that As you're saying that, we gotta let the human body do what the human body does, right? Which is healing, and that takes
Right.
time. And one of the things I did want to ask you about is kind of the future of medicine. And we'll start with just kind of the near term, some of the alternative treatments that people are talking about here to expedite healing. I'm thinking specifically of things like stem cells. I'm thinking of, this near red light and red light therapy type things. Are these things that you are seeing in your practice or just in practice in general as helping to expedite healing? Is there validity there? Is it too soon to tell? Are there other things that I'm not thinking of that are here or in the near future that will help us? Because you kind of said, the human body is the human body. Is technology speeding this up yet, or do you think it ever will?
Oh, there's some great stuff. I mean, and just roll it back a half a second. So the years and years ago, and having the ability of having a lot of perspective, being in practice a long time, years and years ago, we used to fix the meniscus and then wait and do the ACL later because people got stiff. And we do these open operations and people got very stiff and said, well, you're so stiff, we can't really do your ACL now. We'll do it later when you're not so stiff. And what we found is that if you do the ACL and the meniscus arthroscopically at the same time, the meniscus heals better. And the reason that is, in my mind, and it's debatable, but I think what happens is you drill these tunnels to put the ACL in. And because you let stem cells from the marrow leak into the knee through the bone tunnels, those stem cells help the meniscus heal, right? So your body has stem cells. And the question is, can you recruit them and can you use your own stem cells? Some people have gotten a little carried away. We say we put stem cells in everything. And the reality is, if they're not your stem cells, maybe not so great. If they are your stem cells, it's an expensive proposition for something your body might heal by itself. So I think for most of these things, we've learned that if you can create an environment where stem cells are available in the natural healing process, you can improve things. So like, for example, in shoulder arthroscopy, when I'm doing a rotator cuff repair, I clean a little bit of the bone off where it's going to be put back. And I clean it off enough so that the bone marrow will leak a little bit into the space and you'll carry your own stem cells into that space, right?
And
By doing
the
ACL,
idea of there is to facilitate the healing process, right? That's
well, I mean,
specifically why
naturally,
you're.
that's what your body would do, right? But if I just took the tendon, let's say the bone was smooth, I
Mhm.
just took the tendon and tacked it right to the bone, and I didn't stimulate the surface, sometimes either by drilling little tiny holes or shaving it down a little bit, stimulate the surface to get marrow cells to leak onto there, to actually make the body think it's a fresh injury,
Mm.
right? I won't get the advantage of the body's own stem cells really being there. A lot of them. Stem cells will migrate to an injury anyway, because there's chemotactic factors. And then there's foreman stem cell, right? Which I like to use more than anything else if you're going to do stem cell type stuff. And that's like PRP, right? Platelet rich plasma, because the platelet rich plasma has stem cell growth factors and you theoretically recruit them chemically without having to go through the rigmarole of going into your marrow, right? So I think there's advantages there. Those uses are limited because they've been deemed mostly experimental, right? The insurance companies don't really pay for those.
Oh,
So it's
gotcha.
really
Okay.
dealer's choice for patients, whether they want to do it or not. And some people charge a lot for that and some people don't charge as much. The prices vary all over the country where you are and whether or not the person has done Kobe Bryant's knee or not, that might change
Yeah.
the price.
Right.
But essentially it's the same idea for all of that. Those are things that are still a little bit on the fringe for some of the uses that they're used for. So like example, bad Achilles tendonitis, bad tendonous elbow, PRP seems to work really nicely. Whether PRP helps a rotator cuff repair heal faster when I've already done marrow stimulation, I don't really know if it makes that much difference, right? Because I've done something that I think is stronger in the
Right.
time of surgery. If I've already put holes for an ACL in your knee and you got marrow leaking in from the tunnels that are quite good and very good marrow bone, which your femur and your tibia, adding PRP or stem cells to that, I don't see the value of that, right? So, but I think a lot of people do those kinds of things.
Mhm.
The other area of expertise, which is really fantastic, and I like doing this too, and it's unbelievable. But it's again specific indication. So that's another thing. Like once you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? You know that expression, right?
Yep.
But there are certain things that are very specific. So there's something called MACI, which is matrix, which we impregnate with your own cells, and it's for cartilage replacement. So what MACI does, if, let's say I have someone who's in their late 30s, early 40s, who knocks off a piece of cartilage on their femur and their knee. And now they have a big pothole there. And the rest of the knee is pretty good. It's not a terribly arthritic knee in any stretch. and there's a good wall of cartilage around it, but there's a defect that's significant. And I know that defect's going to cause arthritis later in life. We can go in arthroscopically, harvest some cells, take little chiclets, if you will, little pieces of cartilage, and send them to a lab. The lab will take 5,000 cells and make them 10 million cells in culture, and they're your cells. They clone them, right? Now you have your cells, they impregnate it into a collagen matrix, and now I go back, open your knee up, and glue the collagen matrix back to the defect, and now you grow your own cells back. And I've done that quite a number of times now over the years, and for the right indications, it's really worked really, really nicely. And it's a solution that we didn't have 20 years ago, right? And in fact, we had solutions in the United States that were similar to that 10 years ago or more. It was much more technically challenged because we didn't have it impregnated on the matrix and you had to do all kinds of things to make it work. But now we have this other way of doing it and it seems to be a lot better and more reproducible. You can also do cartilage transplant, like a fresh frozen cartilage from a cadaver for a big defect in a young person. I once had someone, I had a bad motorcycle accident, basically degloved, removed the surface of a large part of their femur. The person was 21 years old and the defect was quite big and involved the bone. And we had to wait 4 months to get a match because not a match like you think of a kidney transplant. It's a match size and shape, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Because, if I take a little girl's femur and I take a piece of cartilage from there and I put it in a 6'2" basketball player, it's not going to work, right? But if I have someone whose shape of their bone matches on MRI, the measurements I've made to the shape of the person, I can then use a very technical piece of equipment and match a plug that I take from the exact same spot on that bone to match the defect in the other one. So the curvatures will match. So that's technically very challenging. It takes quite a few hours to do.
Mm.
So that's a thing to do. That's also technically possible these days. Yeah. Then fixing ligaments like we couldn't fix before, realigning bones the way we couldn't do it before. There's a lot of technical advantages there. So, but a lot of things that are out there, people apply them to everything. And then that's always not the right idea.
Okay. So yeah, I'm with you there. What about, it seemed like 3D printing had a minute and I haven't heard a whole lot about that technology. Are we 3D printing parts for bone cartilage replacement, repair? Yeah. Is that a
There's
thing?
a huge number of experimental things going on now for that kind of stuff. It is a challenge to figure out where the expense meets the road, right? Because let's say a 3D print knee replacement that matches you perfectly, that might be quite expensive. And the marginal gain, knee replacements complications are 0.5%, or something like that. The marginal gain might not be enough to make it worthwhile. On the other hand, if I have a pelvic fracture and a defect and a missing bone and I need a hip replacement, I might 3D print a 3-dimensional piece of pelvis that's metal that might match that defect, or I have to resect a big tumor and the defect is going to be something very odd and unusual to you that we don't have a standard thing that's going to ever work for you. And I might 3D print that, or conversely, have a complicated reconstruction to do because the pelvis is malformed, a congenital defect as a child. I could 3D print a model of that and do a trial operation on the 3D model, right? Where you see like when they separate the Siamese twins, they might print a 3D model of their heads before they do the operation, right? And try a trial operation before they do it. So the technology there is fantastic. And then there's 3-dimensional controls. There's, computer guided surgery where you actually have the computer guiding the cuts and helping you limit where you cut them and lining them up. But then the problem is you need an expert to make sure you lined up the first cut properly in the first place, because if that's perfectly wrong, the whole thing will be perfectly wrong, right?
Right.
It'll be all exactly wrong the same amount. So you have to have a good operator in the first place, and you have to have someone comfortable with equipment. People always ask me, oh, I want this special knee from some company. And I don't do knee replacements in my practice anymore. And my partners do that. I do all the soft tissue stuff, which in a lot of ways is somewhat more challenging because the knee replacement, I put a whole new piece in, I kind of know what I've done, right? In cartilage, I'm go to the lab, grow it up, glue it in. Now I got to wait. I'm baking the souffle every day,
Right.
And so my souffle things are always a lot trickier because it's like a psychological challenge for me and the patient to make it through all the time it takes to get it done. But you do the knee in 6 weeks, it's in, it's glued in, it's good, when you do a knee replacement. But having said that, there are computer generated templates generated from MRI and so on to do total knees. And there are computer generated ways of putting them in, and the materials are excellent. But what I was going to say, and I got a little sidetracked, but I'll just get back to it. if I go to a doctor who uses Brand X all the time for total knees, and Brand X has the equipment, they have hundreds of sizes to choose from and mixing, matching the parts and all kinds of gizmos that correct all the problems in the universe built into their set. And I'm comfortable with that. And I asked the guy to use someone else's tray and set and instruments. I'm putting a big disadvantage because if you have the 1 in 10 or the 1 in 100 that needs something special out of the tray that rarely gets used, the guy who does 1,000 of them for one system is going to know how to do that like a minute. The guy who never used that system before is going to have a hard time figuring out. So people, I think, sometimes put their cart before the horse. You want to have a surgeon you trust. You want to have a surgeon who's knowledgeable. You want a surgeon who's good track record. You want to let him do the system that's best in his hands. If it's computer guided, fine. Yep. If it's Zimmer's, whatever, contact knee, it's fine. If it's J&J's knee, and that's the one they like because they have 6 reasons why that works better in their hands and they get excellent outcomes, just go with it. Yep. Sometimes they like, if you go to a wedding and you tell the caterer, I want this and that, and the guy does 3 weddings a weekend for 365 days a year, and he does other parties and he knows how.
Probably pretty good at it. Yeah.
They're usually pretty good at it. And you say to them, are you sure the steak's going to be cooked? And they roll their eyes, right? Because they do this every weekend. You're not the first wedding they've ever done. So I always try to think about that because, having had my children get married and gone through the process and understanding how it is on my side of the table, sometimes they say, say to yourself like, okay, you can't worry about some of these details. They do this all the time.
Yeah.
I know you're worried that the chairs are going to be in the wrong place, but they did 4 weddings this week. They did 4 weddings this week and they got another 50 scheduled before yours. And so that's where we are.
So I know we're coming up on time here, but I do want to ask you, just speaking of kind of cutting edge, I'd love to hear you speculate a little bit about where do you think medicine and technology will be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What's not just right around the corner, but what's maybe possible? And I realize I'm asking for a conjecture, but what are you excited about when you look out 10 years in this field?
Oh, there's like 100 things, first of all, because
is there?
So,
okay.
So there's like 100 things, but certainly I think we'll understand better the way to coax cells to do the things we want, right? Make them dance, right? So if we maybe regenerate cartilage better in situ from even old cells, get them to wake up and get more cartilage in your knee. Maybe that would be happening. Definitely we'll have much more genetically engineered stuff. Like there's examples where you inject a virus in someone's eye and they can see because they replace an enzyme in a cartilage and an enzyme system that is broken. And maybe some people are predisposed to arthritis because they're missing a certain enzyme. And we know that, we figure it out, and you give them a virus and the virus infects the cells and the cells now get the enzyme and now they're okay again. There's all kinds of musculoskeletal disorders that I think they're on the verge of figuring things like that out. That's huge. I think the biologics that we use are going to get better. I think the anti-inflammatories, you might get a swab of your cheek and they'll tell you which 3 inflammatories to take. It'll be good for you and which ones not to take because they're going to elevate your blood pressure. You can just go on and on. AI has got a lot of things. I'm very interested in AI. I've written a lot of articles on AI in medicine and ethics of that. And ChatGPT is going to do some things that are going to be very interesting and scary at the same time because it does hallucinate and make things up. So you got to be a little careful. And I think we're in danger though, and I want to warn patients about this, is that I really feel like the uber specialization that's going on in medicine today, where everyone is fine tuning everything so well that you only see the guy who does the left toenail and he doesn't care about anything else because it's not in his lane, is great if you have a left toenail problem, but it's terrible if it's your right pinky toe and not your left big toe, So I think that for me, the frustration I see as being an older doctor, and I don't want to say old, I hate saying that word, but someone with more mileage on my car and maybe a little more experience, is that I see a lot of people come in who are bewildered by the fragmentation of healthcare. Yeah. They really don't know what to go to their primary care for. They don't know what to go to the pharmacy for. They don't know, and I worry about that. I worry about going to a pharmacy for every flu shot and every other thing, and getting your testing and whatever. And at the end of the day, you never see a primary care who doesn't notice you lost 6 pounds without trying and you look a little green because you have pancreatitis or maybe a pancreatic tumor or something like that, or your liver's gone awry, because he sees you every 6 months and he takes one look at you and he says, you don't look good. I'm going to do some more tests. So I think we've lost that. And I think that younger people have made medicine more transactional. in that way. And when it's more transactional, what are you going to do for me today? There's no longevity. And then, so the computers take over the longevity, but then it's a black box. We don't know what the computers know and don't know. And you don't even know it. And if
Right.
your doctor sees you, there's so much information, he can't figure it out. So I think the criminal part of all that is the charts on the computer are so big that we have AI programs that are going to interpret the charts. And what are they going to do? They're going to give us a version of the chart, which is the same chart we used to have when we had a paper chart, which
Mhm.
is only pertinent negatives and pertinent positives. So you can sort out what's really wrong, as opposed to check all the boxes and the chart is 17 pages long, but most of it is meaningless today,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So I worry about that as a big problem as medicine goes forward.
Well, I'm a little bit curious as you mentioned that, because I do feel like medicine is becoming more specialized, more fragmented, and as a consumer, it can be challenging to navigate that. And I'm speaking as a consumer who's blessed with really good health. I don't interact with that very much, but just as we're wrapping up here, what can we do as consumers of healthcare to be good patients, to be good stewards of our health, and to ensure that we navigate this crazy maze and all that's coming, to ensure that we're healthy and vital well into our later years?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great advice I can give in that respect. And it has nothing to do with orthopedics, but it's important
Mhm.
because I see it all the time. I think the first thing and the number one problem with most patients is compliance. So like the doctor says, do X, Y, and Z, and they go home, they read the package label, even though they've had a healthy discussion with the doctor about whether or not that medication is good or not for them, they don't take it. They come back 6 weeks later and I said, did you take X, Y, Z to work for you? Oh yeah, I read the label and it said all these things. So I didn't take it. Now the truth is the pharmacy has to show you the label. You should read the label. You should know something about it. You should alert your doctor if there's something on there that bothers you. But the idea that you go home and you decide on your own not to take it, and then 6 weeks later you come back for a follow up, and I have no information whether I've been helpful to you or not, right?
Yeah.
And you come back with the same complaint 6 weeks later, and we've gotten nowhere in making progress of trying to treat you because you didn't tell me you decided not to take the medication, or I've prescribed physical therapy and you didn't go, or I asked to get an MRI and it turns out that for whatever reason someone dropped the ball, and you figure yourself that it's not important. With some clerk somewhere I don't know anything about. No one's told me you didn't go. You don't know how critical it was, but I decided you needed the test. 6 weeks later, you come back and you haven't gone, and we're back at square one. Or worse, the pre-approval for the MRI is now expired, and I have to start
Mm.
all over again to get the
Yeah.
insurance company convinced to get you the test. Or conversely, the insurance company has decided arbitrarily they don't want you to have that test today, or they don't want you to have the medication I asked for. And you go home and you say, oh, my doctor must be an idiot, so I'm not going to call them back. And sometimes some of those things they do are so arbitrary and have nothing to do with you or what's wrong with you. Someone is reading that who's not as educated as I am, or a computer program has kicked out the
Right.
word because whatever happened in transcription, the wrong word got written in, or I didn't say the right buzzword for that company, which is just so disturbing, right? They wanted me to say your kneecap is tilted, and I say your kneecap's malaligned. And malalignment to them doesn't mean the same thing as the word tilt. And they're looking
Right.
for tilt, and they kick you out because they didn't say tilted, or they didn't say tilted by 20 degrees. And it's frustrating for me, but even more so is the way they tell you is inflammatory. Your doctor didn't do X, Y, and Z, so therefore we're not going to have your test. But your doctor knows why you needed it, and your doctor did examine you, and your doctor documented what was wrong. They just didn't like the way he did it. And they've decided that means they can delay your treatment.
Mm.
And I find that that's a little criminal. And the criminal part of it is, number one, they make you feel like your doctor's an idiot. That's criminal because your doctor actually knows what he wants you to do. And number two, you don't then comply because you think the insurance company is telling you something about your doctor instead of telling you something about how crappy they are.
Right.
you know,
I think everybody listening can certainly relate to the frustration of going through that. Like I said, I'm
it's
blessed that I
it's
haven't interacted a
unbearable.
whole lot with the medical system, but I've experienced very similar things, right? And certainly with family members and other folks, it can be it's a lot, especially for us as lay people, right? I don't live in that world. It's
Right.
foreign to me, and so when I get in there, it's a wilderness anyway. And then to have that sort of scenario that you just described play out is it's incredibly frustrating. Yeah. Okay. Well, what I heard in there was certainly also as patients, we can be compliant and we can be communicative. I think that those are two things that can certainly help us on our healthy aging journey.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Resnick, where can people connect with you? Is there a place you want to send people who'd like to learn
Sure.
more or connect with you?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So there's two resources I have for patients. One is drreznik.com, and it's an unusual spelling. So if you mess it up, you can't get it. It's DRREZNIK. So there's no C and no S in there. So it's drreznik.com. And I have a bunch of articles there and a bunch of things that are related to the book and my two books that are out there. I have a knee and shoulder book, obviously, and then I have a book on fall and fall risk. More for patients. We're talking about that, falling and fall risk gets more and more important as you get older.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a little book on, it's called I've Fallen and I Can Get Up, as
Right
opposed
on.
to Fallen and I Can't Get Up. I couldn't stand that commercial.
Right.
And the other one is my website for my practice, which is ct-ortho.com, connecticutortho.com. So ct-ortho. And then on that website, if you find me and then you follow my page, I have a huge amount of resources for patients above and beyond what, other things that are separate from stuff in the book. The book I have the most detailed and probably the best down to earth explanation of the book, because it was heavily vetted by a lot of people. On the CT-ortho site, there's more technical stuff and more stuff specific for specific surgeries. So maybe a little more directed towards patients who are actually having a specific problem, fixing it and following up. But I also have some fun things on there and some videos and stuff on both of those websites. I have about 18 videos on YouTube connected on the Dr. Reznik site that explain different surgeries or show different things and some fun things that are easy to watch, like a couple of cartoons about ACL tears and kneecaps dislocating, things like that. So I've been doing it for 30 years. So I have a lot of information online out there for people. And I just feel like, and this is the beginning of the book, I feel like the most educated person who comes to me, who's read enough and knows enough of the stuff from the right resources, is sometimes my best patients. But the problem is it's hard to find things that are really well vetted. And then I just decided I got to just put stuff up there because some of the stuff is just too far out there to be useful for some people.
Got it. All right. Thank you for that. And folks, I will put all of those resources into the show notes. You guys can find that there. Dr. Reznik's new book is The Knee and Shoulder Handbook, A Key to a Pain-Free Active Life. He's got that set up I believe there's a section basically for the younger folks and then for those of us in my age bracket. So a lot of really good resources there. Dr. Reznik, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing obviously your passion, but all your knowledge, your wisdom with us. And I commend the work you're doing and just encourage you to keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me. I love to have the opportunity to chat with you. And I have to tell you, great questions today. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's our show for today, folks. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I want to let you know that we have other free resources over at silveredgefree.com. There, you'll find our free guides with our top tips on nutrition, exercise, and healthy lifestyle to assist you in your weight loss and fitness journey. So feel free to head over there and download anything that looks useful to you. I'll put the links to everything we talked about in the show notes, and you can find those over at silveredgefitness.com/244. As we wrap up our time together today, you can show your support for this show in two important ways. The first is to tell a friend about this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen. The second is for you YouTube folks to click the like and subscribe buttons, and for you podcast folks to please give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.